Well, welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. As some of you may know, I'm chairman of a civic advocacy organization called Transit Alliance. And in that regard, I've become very aware of an organization in Toronto called Bild. And I've got three members of that organization with us tonight. Dave Wilkes, who's the president and CEO. Paula Tenuta, is that correct? Tenuta, I apologize, Senior VP Policy and Advocacy, and Justin Sherwood, who is in witness protection. Actually, that's just a joke because we can't get good light on him, but he's the Senior VP Communications and Stakeholder Relations. So gentlemen and Paula, welcome to my show. How are you?
We're great, and it's a bit of a bad joke of our communications guys and witness protection, but whatever.
but it's appropriate given the shadow that he's in. Dave, maybe I can turn to you. What is Bild?
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for the opportunity. The three of us are really looking forward to this conversation. So Bild stands for the Building Industry and Land Development Association. So we're a trade association that represents builders, developers, professional renovators, and suppliers to our industry. Our members' job is building housing of all types across the Greater Toronto Area and Simcoe, as well as employment spaces. So we're the association that represent where you work and where you live.
Excellent. And Paula, maybe I can ask you, we'll get into it in far greater detail undoubtedly, but what are the issues, the big issues that are impacting the industry given COVID-19?
Oh, well, let me actually rewind this a little bit because I think it's important for you to understand that Dave mentioned what Bild was at, but a little bit more about what we do as well. In terms of my job in our department, we have our pulse on the ground in terms of all those issues, Brian. And we cover issues all across the GTA. And we have dialogue with everyone from the regional level in terms of politicians down to the staff level. And we touch on issues. I can give you information on anything from an A-frame sign bylaw all the way up to provincial initiatives that affect our industry and the way they do business. Land use policy, zoning bylaws, official plans, and I know we'll get more into the COVID discussion as we get into this conversation.
Okay, so maybe I can turn to you, Justin. What do you think? What are the big issues that have impacted your industry with COVID-19?
Well, why don't I just back up and let you know a little bit about what I do. I handle the communications for Bild, and I also manage our research agenda, which means I work with outside third parties to commission studies on anything from fees and policies and bylaws to land use policy, you name it, and we publish those studies and put them in the public domain, essentially to inform the public debate. In terms of the big issues, I think that, and I'll leave it obviously to Dave and Paula to elaborate a lot more, but one of the challenges is there's a misconception that just because we were able to continue to work through COVID-19, that the industry wasn't impacted, and I don't think it's a secret that the GTA had a housing supply shortage and an affordability challenge already. And we're seeing delays in bringing new housing to market. And that is a concern for us because from our perspective, and I'll leave it to Dave to elaborate, one of our big focuses is how we can work with the municipalities and the provincial government to increase housing supply to address the historical challenges and the generational challenges that we're seeing across the GTA.
Awesome. Dave Wilkes, Paula Tenuta, Justin Sherwood, all of Bild, thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to take a quick break for messages and come back with these three executives from Bild, a trade association in the building and land development business, in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting about the building industry and the land development business tonight. We've got three executives with Bild, that trade association in that area right now. Dave Wilkes, who's the president and CEO. Paula Tenuta, who's the Senior VP Policy and Advocacy, and Justin Sherwood, who is the Senior VP and Communications and Stakeholder Relations. Dave, maybe I could turn to you. I understood that there were a couple of recommendations that you have been making recently to get the housing business going again. And one of them is to suspend the Canadian mortgage stress test. Another one is to transfer mortgage tenancy to date of occupancy for new condos. A third is to eliminate the security deposits for the Ontario land transfer tax on affiliated transfers. A fourth is to freeze municipal increases to property tax reassessments. And a fifth is to freeze development charges. That's a pretty extensive list of requests. Can you give me a sense of why all these requests and why this much attention should be paid to the development business?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. And I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Justin and Paula, to provide some more of the details of it. But Brian, we were recognized as an essential workplace throughout the pandemic. And I think the provincial government, we were grateful for that recognition, and we took the responsibility to ensure that we delivered that, and by providing a safe and environment for workers to conduct the construction that was required. And the responsibility to continue to provide housing throughout the pandemic and provide a place for people to live, recognizing that we already had a shortage of housing in the GTA, is transferring into the recovery. And we really believe that the housing industry can be an engine of growth for the GTA, but we also believe that the GTA can be an engine of growth for both the province and the country. We represent approximately 20% of the national GDP within the GTA. We represent about 50% of the GDP for the province, and within those, the city. The housing industry is a key driver both of direct and indirect employment. We have some stats that I'd like to share with you. There's 366,000 workers are directly employed in our industry, $22 billion in wages.
Sorry, hold it. 336,000 workers in what? In Ontario or in Canada?
In the GTA.
In the GTA.
That are directly employed by our industry in all its various aspects. $22 billion in wages, $40 billion in investments. But it gets more than that. It's the amount of revenue that is generated for governments through our industry. If you take a benchmark of 1,000 new housing starts, let me reiterate, person years of labor, 2,400 person years of labor. But here's some numbers. HST, $72 million. Land transfer tax, $11 million. DCs, $80 million, and education development charges, $5 million. So we're not only a generator of employment, we're a generator of revenue for government. So the recommendations that you referred to, Brian, we put together with our colleagues at the Ontario Home Builders and Canadian Home Builders a set of 20 recommendations on how construction can kickstart the economy. And you've referenced a few of them, and perhaps I'll just get Justin and Paula to give some more details around those. We also recommended a renovator home renovation tax credit for homeowners. So Justin, maybe talk a little bit about the renovation tax credit, the CERTI bonds, and then Paula will get to some others.
Certainly. So Dave's asked me to highlight two for you, Brian. The first is a home renovation tax credit. And I think you'll recognize there's been various predecessor programs for home renovation tax credits, generally focused in on energy efficiency and achieving environmental objectives by retrofitting houses to improve their energy efficiency and their CO2 footprints. And they existed at a federal level and as well at a provincial level for a period of time. One of the criteria for those was you had to use a professional renovator or a recognized company to do it. It couldn't be a cash job. It couldn't be done off the books. And one of the interesting benefits of those home renovation tax credits, and you can get this information from the Ministry of Finance yourself, is in the end, they ended up being relatively tax neutral. Because if the job is being done by a professional renovator or a legitimate company as opposed to the gray economy. And I think we do all have to recognize that in the home renovation space, there is a tremendous gray economy. Wages, taxes on wages are accruing back. HST is accruing back. All of the various employment-related taxes and expenditures are accruing back. And so you get a double benefit. You get the benefit of in this case, better environmental footprint, which is facilitates the policy objectives of the government. And then additionally, you get the benefit of addressing the gray economy, which is always a problem, not just in the GTA, but straight throughout the country as you're taking a look at renovations.
Justin, let me ask you a question if I could. I can't tell you how many people that I know that are doing things with their houses to equip it for home offices. I got a buddy that's changed a shed that he's got in the back of his house into the most fantastic home office that you've ever seen. Lots of people are doing things. Like, isn't that something that's really happening because of COVID-19? People are renovating their houses because they're spending a lot more time in them.
I couldn't agree more, but one of the recommendations we made is to specifically to address aging in place. I think we all recognize that we have an aging population. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has called into question
Long-term
whether you would want to be in long-term care or whether you would
Sure.
prefer to age in place. One of our elements of what we've been recommending is, don't make this renovation tax credit just about energy efficiency. Make it about aging in place as well, and allow people to stay in their homes longer. Help equip aging homeowners by retrofitting their houses. More accessible bathrooms, more accessible entranceways, ramps, you name it, so that people can enjoy their investment and stay in their home longer rather than going into a long-term care facility. That, I think, has a very, very beneficial effect from a societal perspective, from a business perspective in terms of the renovation services that are provided, and from the government perspective, because you're keeping people out of long-term care facilities, of which a certain portion of those are supported by the state.
Okay.
Paula, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about freezing DCs and some of the other ones and Brian, I know part of the context that we have is, aren't the municipalities running out of money? Why are we asking for money? How can we have the nerve, if you will, to ask for things like freezes on DCs and land transfer tax? Paula, some perspective on that?
Yes, for sure. And Brian actually mentioned an interesting point as well about the change in office environments. And I hope we get a chance to go back to that. But on the municipal development charges, and it's not just development charges, there's various other planning fees and development related fees that our members do pay. And I think I want to be clear about 3 points related to these, because yes, you're right. The first set of recommendations do address, or they give home buyers more breathing room. And then it looks as though we're asking municipalities to forego some of their much needed revenue. But an important point is that when municipalities collect development charges or planning fees, any fees related to development, it goes into a specific reserve fund that is earmarked for services that are related to that development. So in theory, we aren't really taking money away from those municipal coffers. And again, Brian, we aren't asking these municipalities to forego these payments or our members to forego these payments. We're asking that perhaps they pay them later on in the process. And let me give you an example. A developer submitting his project application will pay his application fees at the time that he submits. And we're suggesting that perhaps they should have the ability to pay later on, such as when that application is approved. And I think a third important point to note is that COVID has really changed the way we think about certain things. For example, the retail landscape has definitely changed, and some of our members are already thinking about creating ways to change those sort of spaces. They pay fees and development charges for even those retail spaces. So one would argue that those development charges should either be reduced or at least looked at with an incentive-based approach if municipalities do in fact continue to want to grow these sorts of retail spaces. So a lot of room for creative thinking, as I'd like to say.
Paula, what do you think is going to happen to retail? Are you suggesting that we're going to have a lot of bankruptcies and empty retail spaces?
No, I think it's going to change. We have members who are also in the industrial space, and they plan those big warehouses for the Amazon type of things. And they're prepared. They've already prepared for acquiring more of these spaces. It'll change and it'll shift, just like the housing has shifted from suburban to more higher intensity forms of development, which I know you wanted to talk to as well. So we're going to have to adapt. There's COVID. We don't want to do things the same way that we used to. We want to do things better and more creatively.
What you were arguing is that the development charges on retail spaces should be reduced. So you're suggesting that there's going to be, you think, a challenge for retail space. Is that going to be in malls? Is that going to be on main streets? Is it everywhere?
I think it's everywhere. And let me give you an example of it in a mall. They may have to increase some of their amenity space where there's more walkability. So we may see more designs. I think you still might get the actual, people are going to want to shop. I remember Vaughan Mills, as soon as they said they were open, I happened to be in the area. People really wanted to continue to use that retail space.
I went to the local mall just this past weekend because I had to buy a computer, and the Apple store was socially distancing and limiting the number of people in the place, but the concourse outside was packed. And yeah, they were trying to line them out a couple of feet apart, but it was packed. And the worst place to be would be in the concourse, not inside the store.
So the redesign of there's a lot of public forum discussions right now. You want to start to look at redesigning those elements, make more amenity space. And our members are quick to adapt. I think that's the beauty of our industry. They will address market demand, and they are quick to, I hate to use the word pivot, I'm a hockey mom, but they're quick to adapt to what consumers want and to what the market wants. So we're going to evolve. It's going to give a good opportunity to change.
Just in case some of our listeners aren't aware, can you explain what a development charge is and how it gets charged?
Okay, so I'm a policy wonk, so I'm going to be as basic as I possibly can here. Essentially, there is a charge that a developer will pay to help provide for the infrastructure that is going to be built to support that new growth. So growth, paying for growth is essentially what it is. I know Dave has the statistics at the top of his head, and he'll talk about the percentage of the actual home price, but cumulatively they are quite high. So it's a charge that a developer will pay as part of their application fees to come to an end product, whether they're building a house or a non-residential product or retail. It's part of providing for the infrastructure and helping municipalities build what they need to build to support that growth and development.
I've had numerous developers in suburban GTA complain to me that the way the development charges are charged biases in an inappropriate way, not a market demanded way of what they're going to build. And therefore, sometimes what it does is it influences the decision making to build lower density than the market would want. And frankly, than we would want if we want to have livable, walkable environments close to transit. Is that got any validity to it?
I see Dave smiling.
Oh, can I jump on this one, Paula?
Sure, by all means.
Okay, so just before we get to that, I've been itching to tell you, Brian, that one of the most important things that your readers need, or your listeners need to understand, is that 25% of on average, of the cost of a new home or condominium apartment is composed of government fees, taxes, and charges assessed by all three levels of government. One of the biggest ones.
What? 25, a quarter of the cost.
A quarter of the cost. A quarter of the cost. One of the biggest ones is development charges, which in the GTA account for about 10% of the cost of a new single-family house or high-rise. Slight variations municipality to municipality. You're talking in the order of magnitude of $100,000 and some odd for development charges in some communities. On top of that, and we'd love to be able to give you a sneak peek of this, we've just done a benchmarking study where we are actually comparing fees, taxes, and charges across the country. And one of the interesting things is the GTA is the most expensive jurisdiction when it comes to government-added fees, taxes, and charges, not just in Canada, but in North America. And I'd love to be able to send that to you.
By how much?
By a lot, almost double in most instances.
And so if we're worried about affordability, government is one of the biggest issues here.
I think the point to remember is that if you take a look, on average, a developer margin in producing a community is somewhere in between 8 and 12%. And the government's taking 25. So they're taking roughly double.
Okay, but if it's justified because they got to build a road or put in a sewer or put in a water main, I can understand it. But what you're suggesting is they're taking a lot more than they should.
Well, what I'm suggesting is I think that there is always room for discussion in terms of taking a look at how growth pays for growth. In fact, the provincial government has just finished an extensive discussion on that, and we're looking forward to increased clarity, increased consistency in terms of, and predictability in terms of what is actually included in a development charge.
And transparency.
And transparency. In some cases, it was a little bit like looking into a black box and you didn't really know what you were going to get. The government's actually bringing forward some changes that will make it very predictable and clear and transparent to all concerned.
Dave, maybe I could ask you a question. The other complaint I get from a lot of developers is just the time for approval, that the bureaucracy of applying for zoning, building permits, official plan amendments, whatever it is the most bureaucratic of any kind of approval other than maybe Health Canada.
So let me give you some good news and some bad news. I agree. Another one of the studies that we've done demonstrated how long it takes for those approvals. 10 to 11 years, way too long. Way too long in a growth environment that we had. It's led to some of the challenges we have around the housing supply shortage that we went into COVID in. We're short 10,000 units with a year based on the demand that we are seeing through the population growth, which is leading to the affordability challenges. But, and I'm going to get Paula to give some more details on this, we've really seen a shift with COVID. We've seen municipalities look at how they can work differently. We've seen cultural changes. We've seen a speeding up of the process, anywhere from public meetings being held virtually to allowing applications to be submitted digitally. And it was a constant reframe we had at Bild that it was just taking too long to make simple decisions. Absolutely. I really do believe, and I'm hopeful, that as we come out of this pandemic, that we are going to see that cultural shift of how do you get to yes as to how do you say no, 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 because of the recognition of a couple of things, Brian. We do need the housing supply, fundamental. We are a driver of the economy, as we started earlier. And, you know, as you cooperate and collaborate on community building, as we've been talking about, it does provide opportunity to understand how you get to that development quicker than the 10 to 11 years that we were providing as the benchmark earlier. We've seen across North America half that time for approving developments, half that time for zoning approval. We need to be thinking
where would that be?
So, Justin, where's some of the quickest areas for development approvals?
Well, if you take a look at the spectrum, and I'm gonna pass it down to Paula. Obviously, there's some jurisdictions in the United States that are very quick to approve, and I wouldn't suggest that necessarily is any benchmark that we should be holding up for appropriate planned communities. I don't think we want to necessarily always mimic Houston or other places like that, but they have very, very rapid approval times. If you take a look, and one of our studies is actually looking at 36 different municipalities across the country, there are certainly any number of provinces, mainly out west, from BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, where the planning regimes allow for, and the municipalities are staffed appropriately to allow, and that's another part, and I see Paula nodding her head, allow for almost approval times half of, give or take, half of what we have. But there's a range. I mean, obviously, different municipalities move at different paces. There are some areas that are actually, in some of our studies, worse from approval times than the GTA, but you can count them on less than one hand in Canada.
One would think if we have an affordability issue and we want to build, you know, a better city, a better GTA, that speed of approval would be a competitive advantage for us versus vis-a-vis other competitive environments.
Right.
It is.
So let me, and I'm going to turn it to Paula in 1 second, Brian. That's exactly the conversations we've been having with municipal governments across the GTA, that we don't want to look up in 2 years and see the building have gone elsewhere. I mean, if I use the city of Toronto specifically, they don't want to look up and see the cranes having left the sky, right? Because of all that we've talked about. But Paula, can you perhaps talk a little bit about some of the service delivery changes that we've seen and the competitive advantage that we believe that we can provide by approving faster?
And this is an actual coincidence, Brian, that I'm about to talk to about Mississauga, because Mississauga, in the work that I do, we point to Mississauga as being a poster child for doing things right. And I think you see it on the ground. There are a lot of beautiful developments that already exist and are planned for in the city of Mississauga. Look what's happening down by the waterfront. It's stunning. So a quick little story for you. When COVID happened and municipal and regional buildings had to close very quickly, once the provincial chief medical officer of health recommended the closure of these buildings, we had to reach out and unlock those doors. And what was interesting to see is The municipalities that were able to transition to remote working, a lot of the municipalities that already made those investments were quicker to change their course of action. They had already eliminated the need for in-person hard copy paper submissions. They had things like the city of Mississauga did, which was called e-permitting or e-plans. And other municipalities, I do want to mention them as well. We had York Region who had, they call it York Tracks in York Region. The city of Markham calls it e-plan. But these municipalities who had their electronic online application and permitting system in place already were quick to establish an efficient online system to both review the application from home, approve the application, and issue the permit. And that's where we saw some great efficiencies. And we are going to make sure that other municipalities who are now starting to be as efficient continue on post-COVID. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention the great work that's definitely happening in your city.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. We're having a great conversation about the building industry and the land development business with three executives from the trade association Bild. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can also get me streamed online at www.saga960am.ca. And you can find all my shows, most of them as video casts and podcasts on my website, briancrombie.com. So if you miss one show, you can always check me out later. We're having a good conversation today with three executives from the trade association Bild. Dave Wilkes, who's the president and CAO, Paula Tenuta, who is the head of policy, and Justin Sherwood, who's the head of public relations and communications. Gentlemen, and Paula, thank you so much for joining me today. I wonder if I can be selfish here for a second, as I think you know, because Dave and I have had a couple of conversations about this in the past. I am chairman of Transit Alliance, which is a civic advocacy organization that's really interested in building a far better transit-oriented GTA. And I've had developers tell me that the development charges and other things that we're putting in place actually restrict our ability to build the kind of density that would actually make transit more efficient. And I had one person, use Huron-Ontario as an example, saying that the Huron-Ontario LRT is being built, but it's challenging to actually build the kind of density that would be justified by that LRT and make use of it. I had another person, Jennifer Keesmet, actually former city planner for the city of Toronto, who told me that the planning and zoning along Yonge Street was perfectly appropriate for the Yonge Street subway, but we never did the same thing on Bloor and Danforth. And that one of the big changes we needed to do is to dramatically increase the density from a zoning standpoint along Bloor and Danforth. Justin, what do you say to all that?
You are right, absolutely. And what you have heard is right. I think from a provincial government perspective, the policy intent is to build up, not out. It has many benefits from an infrastructure perspective. It has many benefits from an environmental perspective. And what it does is lead to denser but more walkable, more transit-oriented communities. Entirely desirable, exactly what I think the industry wants to be building and supporting, and exactly what the provincial government wants to see. Unfortunately, what you have is bylaws and planning regimes that are a little out of date. And by the way, I'm not the expert on the planning regime. I'll hand that over to Paula to expand on this.
You're doing a great job, Justin.
But really what we do need to do is take a comprehensive look at all of the zoning bylaws within those types of corridors around major transit station areas, MTSAs as they're called. You see, Paula, I got the acronyms down. And these are areas where you have maybe a GO station, or a subway station, and where you really want to be seeing sort of the type of a denser medium rise to high rise. I mean, we're missing a whole bunch of things that we call the missing middle. We can get into that in another conversation. I'll give you one example of a policy that really needs to be looked at at the municipal level, and that's something called parkland charges. Now, everyone likes a park. Everyone wants a park. Parks are good. We support parks. People support parks. Cities want more parks. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to get a new park. And in some cases, municipalities, what they'll say is, give us cash based on the value of the property in lieu of a park. And that's called cash in lieu of parkland. And so the developer will hand over a chunk of change based on the value of that property. Well, the value of that property, if it's in an urban area close to a major transit hub, you can imagine, is quite high per square foot. And so what it results in is almost a perverse disincentive to density, because what you'll end up with is a parkland charge for an apartment that is not necessarily going to get a new park, that is 2 times greater than you would assess to a single family home in a suburb that will get a new park. And that's just one of any number of examples of where we have policy objectives at the high level, at the provincial government level, that we really need to work down with the municipalities to make sure that we're doing the right thing from a planning perspective. And that's my impassioned
question on this. One of the challenges that I've been told is that versus the places to go legislation that may or may not still be effective, because I think that was a Liberal government policy, but that increased density in the existing urban envelope.
urban course, yeah.
And that there were some people that wanted to go and invade the green belt and start developing in the green belt. And I had people telling me no, that the brown belt, which is industrial land or undeveloped land within the already approved area, has more than enough land available and density available. The problem is that the municipalities aren't actually approving official plans and zoning consistent with the plans from the provincial government. And that if we actually allowed that density, approved that density, we'd solve the problem and wouldn't need any incursion into the greenbelt. Does that make any sense?
The problem is
you've talked our talk, but Paula,
You're talking to us.
well, now I'm getting antsy here, because the problem is municipalities need to update their own policies. Justin mentioned it. Their official plans and their zoning on the ground is so out of date that it does not correlate to provincial objectives, which does include the growth plan, Brian. The province is very aggressively updating the growth plan. They just went through a very comprehensive exercise. They're doing great things to encourage and foster intensification. Minister Clark, it's one of his biggest passions, including transit. We just now need the municipalities to update their own policies to correspond to that, because that's what people choose to live in. We have to provide housing affordability and choice. And in order for us to do that, we all have to work together.
Yeah,
So
and I think it's very, sorry to speak over, I apologize. I think it's very important. You mentioned the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt's off the table. It's certainly, with the provincial government has made that very clear that the Greenbelt is a protected zone. As an industry, we respect that. And I think you're right too, that the yellow belt and the near urban areas, those are the areas we need to be focusing on. There is enough land to support the development we need. As Paula has said, we just need to get on with approving it. And the provincial government, once again, has done a really good job in something called the land needs assessment, where they've looked out further than 10 years or 20 years and looking out 40 years as to what the growth of the GTA needs to be, and starting to designate areas for that growth. And that, with the growth plan and the other things we're talking about, we really are seeing a recognition of addressing some of the structural problems that we've had in the housing market that we need to have percolate down, if you will, into the municipal decision making. So we are seeing change, we are seeing hope, but we can't take our foot off the pedal. And as you've articulated, the industry has been impacted by COVID, and so we need to make sure that we address some of those short-term issues as well.
And how has it been impacted by COVID?
So we did a survey of our members looking at the impacts of COVID. We surveyed over 490 members. 490 companies representing a number of projects. I'll get Justin to give you the details, but in short, over the next 2 years, basically, we'll have lost a year's supply of housing because of delays and other impact. So there has been a specific challenge. And Justin, maybe you could just highlight some of the numbers for us.
Sure, if I could just back up. What I would say, Brian, is we were very fortunate to receive essential workplace designation. It's not a responsibility that our industry took lightly. The impacts that really occurred due to four things. First of all, not all construction activities were allowed to continue at the same pace under the emergency orders. Initially, it was we were allowed to work on housing that was close to completion and closure. Then they allowed site preparation. Then they allowed below grade work. And then they allowed a total resumption of normal construction activity at the end of May. So that was one of the causes of the impacts. The second is we had productivity decreases because we had to implement social distancing. So you couldn't necessarily have 3 drywallers working in the same area. You had to space it out, and that impacted productivity. Then there were supply chain disruptions, border closures, difficulty getting construction materials. And then lastly, and I think Paula alluded to it, some municipalities work better than others in terms of processing applications remotely. And in some jurisdictions, there were delays. Net result is we surveyed our membership. We got back results for 497 active projects across the GTA. 290 of them were located in the city of Toronto alone. And basically 2/3 of them are experiencing delays between 3 and 6 months.
3/4 of them.
Sorry, 3/4 of them.
3/4 of them.
I stand corrected. And then another percentage longer than 6 months. Net result is we handed that data over to Altus Group because we're not very good at crunching numbers, and they're the experts at it. They identified that basically we're going to lose 9,000 units because they in the next 2 years. Another 8,000 units will be delayed longer, which means between the two in Toronto, normally we bring about 20,000 units forward every year. It's like losing 1 year's supply over a 2-year period. The net impact to the governments is $850 million in lost revenue for those, of which 500 million would have gone to the City of Toronto and the balance to other levels of government. We're looking at 10,000 lost jobs. And off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the rest.
So Justin, if we've been closed for 3 months, how do you lose a year's supply?
And allow me to answer that, Brian. It's because of the productivity losses. Justin had mentioned municipal approvals and inspections were slowed down. Supply chains slowed down. Necessary social distancing to ensure the health and safety of the workers, which was our #1 responsibility. So we had to have crews on at different times. You couldn't have everybody there together. So it wasn't the fact that we couldn't work. It was the fact of the way that the industry needed to work and waiting for some of the approvals from certain.
But still, it's only been for 3 months. How does that cost us a year's supply?
Yeah. So Paula, did you want to give a perspective just alone on the municipal approvals, for example?
Well, first of all, remember, we were shut down for a while. There was a time where people were not on the sites, and that did impact things. And there were things that had to happen seasonally that we had to make sure happened. There's landscaping is the right word, site servicing on these larger sites. Seasonal, very seasonal. And then, yes, the municipal delays, the ability for them to even have project intake, because they were completely shut down. There are municipalities who did not have staff who were able to work remotely, period. So, and that's in one, I don't want to point fingers, but that's in one of the biggest municipalities in the GTA. And that's the problem. When you have one of the biggest places.
Let me ask you a question. A lot of people think that we've got an affordability crisis in housing in Canada, at least in major municipalities. During the last municipal elections, it was the #1 issue in Vancouver, in Montreal, and the #2 or 3 issue in Toronto. And a lot of economists think we've got a housing bubble, that the housing prices are outrageous. And I had someone on my show just a week ago that said the only reason why the housing bubble hasn't burst is because of the lack of supply of housing. And you're talking about why that supply of housing may be even more limited. And he said, because of the lack of supply of housing, because of government regulation, all we're doing is making this bubble bigger. And when it bursts, it's going to destroy the home net worth of our homeowners. So if that's true, and I'm not sure if it's true, what that means is we've got to alleviate this year that Justin talks about, or even more, of a supply problem. How do we do that? Half our regulatory approval process? What?
Sorry to interrupt again. You can tell we're all very passionate about this issue. We went into the COVID with a housing supply problem. We were probably 10,000 units short a year based on the growth in the region. It's been exacerbated by COVID and the delays that we've seen. I don't agree that we have a housing bubble. I think the growth that we see in the GTA that has largely been fueled by immigration over the last several years, both from outside the country and people coming into the urban areas from outside, that's going to come back. There is going to be sustained growth in our region. It is one of the best places to live in the world, and I think we'll continue to see that. So I am bullish on the housing market over the long term. But I think, and this is where we are really coming from the 20 recommendations that we've been talking about, Brian. There is an opportunity now, because of the pause that we're seeing, the pause in immigration, where there's an opportunity because of the creativity that we're seeing and the different way of working and the efficiencies and the cultural changes that we're seeing at municipalities across the GTA that Paul has referred to. There's also an opportunity because of the framework that the provincial government has put in place to facilitate growth. So I think the way that we get at the generational challenge we have around housing supply shortages that are leading to the affordability challenge, no question about that, is that we have to think differently about how we tax housing, how we approve development and the speed that it takes, how we build around transit, and how we recognize the growth opportunities that is driven by the sector. If we don't use this opportunity where we are seeing a bit of a pause, we'll have missed yet another opportunity that will become a cost of COVID as opposed to a resetting of our sector.
And I need to add this to Dave's comment.
CEO of Bild, Paula Tenuta, the head of policy development, and Justin Sherwood, the head of communications for Bild. I really appreciate all of your thoughts today. Justin, if people want to track your business, your advocacy, your communication, join your association, do you have a website that they can find you at?
Of course we do, buildgta.ca. And I'd be remiss if I said, Dave mentioned 10,000 a year short. We've been 10,000 a year short since 2006. So you can add that up. That's actually 130,000 aggregate short of where we need to be in the city.
And we need to cut the red tape.
Dave, Justin, and Paula, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brian.
And that's the show for tonight. Join us every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM, or streamed online, or you can get all my podcasts and video casts at briancrombie.com. Thanks, and good night.